All right, it's 6:30. We said we'd start on time, and we will. I think we have a few more coming in, so that's great. See a lot of faces from our last presentation, Richard Leiter, so thanks for coming back. And for those that didn't get to see Richard, the video of that presentation is on our webpage. And Alan's presentation will be on the webpage by tomorrow, latest. So anybody that you know that would benefit and couldn't be here, direct them to that video. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. The presentation will be about an hour. There'll be some Q&A after that. And like really any major event, like the Oscars, there will be an after party at the Muni. So if you don't know where the Muni is, it's just Google Municipal Liquor Store, and there's a little bar and grill that's part of that, and that's where we'll go. So we'll look forward to that. Let me tell you a little bit about Next Chapter for those that haven't been here before. Next Chapter is really all about providing support and resources for people moving from one chapter of life to the next to have a really successful transition. And as we all know, there are a lot of next chapters in our lives. Like in my case, going from work to retirement and wanting to maximize that. For a lot of people, it's loss of a spouse or a loved one. For others, maybe an unexpected career change, divorce. So we're going to try and provide the resources for that. And one thing I'd really ask you all to do is we have a survey up on our webpage. And that's really all about trying to find out what it is that you folks would want, what resources would be most effective, how might you like to be involved. A lot of ways that you could be involved, from greeting to communications to a leadership position on our board, you know, that kind of thing, and lead a support group. So if any of those things resonate with you, sign up. And I will say our goal is not to charge for any of the things that we do, and so if you're so moved and it works for you, we do take a free will offering. It's a basket in the back. So, and if you want to make out a check, make it out to Wayzata Community Church with a memo line of Next Chapter. So let me tell you what's coming up. We've decided to call the month of January the month of Anne, A-N-N-E. And the reason it's the month of Anne is our speaker for January is going to be Ann Harbison. And I think a number of you folks know Ann. She's a member of our church, but incredibly accomplished. So PhD from Harvard. She has a national consulting business where she works with many of the Fortune 500 companies like Boeing and Best Buy, Cargill, companies like that. And the book that she's written could very well be the textbook for Next Chapter. So let me give you the particulars on her book. So her book is called, let's see, where is it here? Yeah, thank you. So, you know, never waste a tragedy. And so her description of what she does is working with the trials and tribulations of life, trying to, you know, maximize that. And so whatever next chapter you're in or going into, her presentation will be really meaningful. So she was recently featured on a TEDx talk about grief, and that's gotten a lot of publicity, and she's been featured in many, many national news outlets. So mark your calendar for January 12th for Ann Harbison. The other Ann, we also have an Ann, I don't see her here, but Ann Johnson Stewart is another of our members, and she's heading into a next chapter of her own. She just retired from the Senate, Minnesota State Senate, and she sold her business, so she's now ready to move on to her next chapter. And she's going to lead a book club in January on the book of, got all my notes here somewhere. The book is called The Second Mountain, and I know I've heard from a lot of people that that's a really exceptional book, again, around the topic of next chapter. So the synopsis of the book is David Brooks explores the 4 commitments that define a life of meaning and purpose to a spouse and family, to a vocation, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. Our personal fulfillment depends on how well we choose and execute these commitments. In the second bound, Brooks looks at a range of people who have lived joyous, committed lives and who have embraced the necessity of dependence. So that'll be in January, more details to follow, but maybe mark that down and maybe see about getting that book. You know, Ann suggests you can reserve it at the library. It's been out long enough that you can probably, buy a used copy. So now, let me get to our speaker. It's exciting to have Alan back in the house. Many of you know Alan from his time here. And I asked Alan just when he got here to say, well, how would you like me to introduce you? What kind of highlights would you like me to do in your introduction? And I haven't looked at it yet, but I just got it. So let me see what it says. Hold on a second. Uh-oh. All right, well, let me kind of get to the highlights here. We'll go back and start at the beginning. Alan won the Beautiful Baby contest in Washington State. Well, let's jump ahead. 2nd grade spelling bee champion. Now let's get up a little more current here. President of the AV Club. I'm going to go to the Cliff Notes version here and kind of skip past that. We're all old enough to Cliff Notes. Anyway, so let me talk about Alan. So he's the founder and leader of a group called House United, whose goal is to bring people together around differences, have courageous conversations. And in our world today, that's pretty critical with all the divisiveness we have. So Alan has a Master of Divinity from Princeton, doctorate from from Yale, sorry. Although that might have been better. But so Yale Divinity, taught at Yale Divinity, and has had various ministerial positions, including here for 7 years. 7 years. And now he works with companies and churches and organizations across the country, really helping them try and, again, help people get together around divides. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Alan. We'll give him a nice warm welcome.
There we go. Jim, you forgot an important page. Well, hello, it's good to see you. And that AV Club presidency was contested vote. It's great to see you. Liz, my wife Liz, sends her greeting and wants me to tell you that she's very jealous because she would love to see you all, and we're trying to work that out for some time in the future. And we just loved our 7 years here. By the way, that's a pretty biblical number of years to stay in a place, so we feel pretty accomplished at that. But we had a wonderful time here, and we will talk a little bit tonight about how this church and this region even give you a bit of a head start on tonight's topic. Tonight's topic is maintaining friendships and communities as you go through and beyond transition. So how do we stay lodged or get new friends as we move into retirement or as we move into the loss of a spouse or all the different kinds of transitions that Jim mentioned in the intro? How do we keep community around us, and how important is that in a world where community is imperiled a little bit? So I want to start, I met a woman on a train. And so, I think we should get a slide there. Oops. That's not the woman on the train. That's Thomas Aquinas on a bad hair day. This is the woman on the train. Some of you know that I'm a relatively extreme extrovert, right? I'm the kind of guy who gets on a plane or a train, and by the time we're done, I know how many kids, how many dogs the person has. I know, what their, favorite color is and that kind of stuff. And there came a time in I think it was September of 2017. So 11 months, 10 months after the 2016 election. And I was doing in Princeton, at Princeton Seminary, a continuing ed event on the sort of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of that week. And it was an intensive with pastors who were trying to figure out, in this new world of polarization, how do we do what we do and how do we lead our people and not lose people because we're having fights and all those things. So it was pretty intense. And I was going to Wellesley, Massachusetts, to help a church do the same kind of things for a couple of days in an intensive. And I was tired. I was tired after the 3 days. So Alan, the extrovert, got on the train in Trenton, bound for Boston, looking for nobody, right? I was looking for the person who kind of is reading into the window and is saying, I don't want to talk to you either, right? And so I'm looking for that. I had to go 4 or 5 cars to find a person who looked kind of dislodged, aloof, doesn't want to talk to me. And I slid in, sat down, and got my Kindle reader out to give her the international sign that I didn't want to be bothered. 30 seconds later, she turns to me and says, so, what do you do for a living? As Jim says, what I do for a living is I go around the nation and try to help people to figure out how to build community and flourish across red-blue lines, across racial lines, across other of the chasms that divide us, right? And so I told her, I said, I've just been to this intensive in Princeton. I'm heading up to this one in Wellesley, and I try to help people come together across difference. People who voted for Trump can't get along with people who voted for Hillary, people who voted, right, all the whole spiel. And while I was telling it, she just started to cry. She had started to weep. And then it kind of turned into a sob over time. And it turns out that she's a blue Bostonian. She and her husband are blue Bostonians, and they had moved to Baltimore, the suburbs of Baltimore, where they were in a kind of blue-red neighborhood. And her neighbor, for 10 years, was also her best friend, but she was red, right? She was a Republican. The person on the train with me was a Democrat. And they were fine for 10 years. And then came the 2016 election. And after the 2016 election, it got hard for them to be in the same room. And the men in the family, they'd do couples and play tennis together, and they'd go out to eat together usually, right? The men in the couple gave up on one another sooner. The women fought for a while to try to hold on to the friendship, and they just couldn't do it. They gave up, and they went their separate ways, and she said, I haven't talked to her for 3 months. We go out to take the garbage out, and we look the other way. Right? So it's a very sad story, and she spills the whole thing, and she says, can you help me? And so I start talking to her about the kinds of things that I do with people around the country. And over the course of those 3 hours of the train ride to Boston, we made some headway. But I said, I'm going to get off the train, and she's going to get off the train, and I hope something is better, but, it's been just a 3-hour talk. Well, just before she left to get off the train, she turned her iPhone toward me, and there was a text on it. She had just texted her friend saying, let's have lunch, right? Which was a very hard thing for her to do, but it was a first step. Now, I tell that story partly just to introduce or reintroduce some of you to what I do for a living and why community and building community is a part of what I'm speaking on tonight. But a real center of this story is friendship. Right? These two women were fast friends for 10 years, did all kinds of things with one another. But then something got between them. And it was politics in this case, but something got between them, and they were both bereft. Sadly, the thing that got between them seemed more important than the friendship they left, right? But the friendship was so valuable that this woman sobbed on a train with a stranger. Tonight we're going to be talking about, in transitions in life, how we hold on to the relationships and friendships and communities we have, and or make new ones on the other side of the transition. And we'll go through sort of different aspects of those two questions, but our purpose will be to come out the other side with a higher value on our friendships and communities in a land that seems to be more easily parting with one another, and some sense of how we might do friendship and community in a lasting way. All right? Does that sound good for a plan? All right. So Thomas Aquinas, the guy with the bad hair day, simple quote. How many of you agree with it? There is nothing on this earth more to be prized than true friendship. How many of you like friendship? Brain scientists tell us we love friendship. These brain scientists put little connectors on our brain, and then they watch what the enzymes and all of the lighting up that goes on, and they find that friendship is a huge lighter-upper. It lights up our brain in ways that a whole lot of other satisfactions and pleasures don't, right? And so we love friendship. And yet, we sometimes give up on our friendships in the name of larger things, or because we get separated, or because transition comes in the way. What I want you to do, those of you who said you do like friendship, tell a story to the person next to you. It's got to be a short story. It's got to be a 1-minute story. But I want you to tell a story to the person next to you that it sort of epitomizes a best friend, what you and a best friend experienced together, or something that makes you like friendship. Okay, so one of you tell the other, 1 minute, and then the second one tell the first one, 1 minute. Just quickly, just to get you acquainted with the people near you. Hello, hello. It's great to see you. It's great to see you. I'm on a mic, so it's great to see you. All right, let's gather back out. That should be enough time. I know you had to tell your story in auctioneer pace, but I hope you were able to summon something that you remember that is an emblem of friendship and its value for you. And it's good to remind ourselves of this, right? It's good to remind ourselves of how important friendship is and the kinds of things that it does in our lives. Scientists, of course, are on this, and so in a series of different research projects by different institutions that are all highlighted in this Why Friendships Are So Important for Health and Well-Being, which is in Everyday Health from an issue in 2021. Here's a list of benefits, and I want you to ask going in, if you saw on television an ad for a product that did all these things, would you buy it? One, friendship promotes a sense of belonging. Two, it boosts self-esteem. Three, it offsets the stressors in your life. Four, it protects cognitive health. Five, helps us cope with grief. Six, encourages healthy behavior because we have people to guard us against those things we probably ought not do. It lowers the risk of long-term health problems. It helps us live longer, and it makes us happier. Anybody want to sign up? That's why you raised your hand. Now, you may not have done the research, but earlier when I asked you like friendship, you like it for some of these reasons, and some of them you didn't even know were happening, right? We like friendship. We like friendship, and yet, Cigna, insurance company in Hartford, was finding that their claim numbers were rising for the very opposites of what was on that last list. Several of those things pertain to health, right? The benefits were health benefits. Cigna got in the business of researching loneliness because they started to see that friendships had given way to loneliness, and that loneliness was causing health problems that they were having to pay claims on. And so Cigna called it a loneliness epidemic. The research has continued both by Cigna and by a lot of other people. It turns out we are getting lonelier as a culture. And it's because we have fewer friendships as a culture. And this connection doesn't take, Sherlock Holmes kind of acuity, right? It seems pretty obvious that if we are not having as many friendships, it's likely that we will be more lonely. But there are there's a backlog of good research and writing on this. For about 50 years, these three authors have ushered us through the gradual atomization of American society. That is, moving to a higher level of individualism and a higher level of separateness for a lot of reasons. That Habits of the Heart was, 1970s. Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam was 1990s. And The Vanishing Neighbor by Mark Dunkelman, he's a Brown scholar, was in, I think, the 2010s, right? And they have, for all these years, and they and people like them, have told us, you know what, if we don't do something, we're gonna start to part enough for it to be dangerous for us to experience harmful outcomes. And so in this context, Bowling Alone, of course, is we're not doing bowling leagues like we used to. We're not doing bridge clubs like we used to. We're not doing those things that had been the glue of society. Now, I would love to ask you why that is, but you don't have microphones on. So I want you to think of why that is. Why you think we gave up on bowling leagues. I mean, they're sweet shoes, right? Just the shoes alone make it worth going out. Why would we give up on bowling leagues? Why would that become less a part? Did people just stop liking to bowl? Or, as Putnam says, are they bowling alone? Why aren't we doing bridge clubs and breakfast clubs and all those kinds of things as much? And I'm going to come back with a counterpoint in a second, but I want you to think of possible causes that you would imagine. What has gotten between us and those kinds of glue activities? Just take a second and think through those. I've got one here, right? Now, let me just say, a lot of my boys are both Gen Z. They're 19 and 17, and they use these to connect a lot. I have one son, Sam, who spent 2 years in online school and made friendships that were at least as close as any I had. Right? So let's not think that this is always an atomizing agent, but I was in having lunch today, or it must have been having breakfast today, and there were a man and a woman who were obviously married to one another, and one was reading this phone and the other was reading that phone, and I just thought it kind of epitomizes the way we roll sometimes. We've taken our eyes off one another sometimes in the name of what? Getting more info on our phone or searching to see whether we have somebody liking something we posted or whatever it is. These can get in the way. We are more mobile as a society than we've ever been. That can undercut friendships and get in the way of us staying in bowling leagues, right? You've got people who used to work for the same corporation for 50 years. You don't have that happen as often anymore. There are a lot of interrupters that aren't on purpose. I'll give you one that is in the realm in which I do my work. 1994, the Gingrich Revolution. Bill Clinton's second year in office. Gingrich and the Reds win the House. And I think that this is a logical thing for Newt Gingrich to do. He tells his caucus, I want you to go and live in your district. I want you to go and live in your district because you can get to know the people so that you actually represent the people. Remember, it was when the language of Washington was derogatory. Oh, they're just Washington insiders was a derogatory thing for those who have been around since 1994. And so Gingrich said to counter that perception, we should live in our districts. And how many think that was a decent idea? Yeah. I mean, it makes sense if you're going to represent your people, if you're going to raise money, all the things that matter for being a legislator. Problem was, when they did that, the Reds and the Blues stopped going to their kids' soccer games together, stopped going to dinner together, stopped going to the opera, stopped all those forms of when we're not in session kinds of things. So the only place they met over time was on the battlefield. And we are seeing the outcomes of that, right? They no longer have friendships the way they used to across the aisle. Now, that's not without exception, right? There's the occasional exception. But the trend was we pal with our people and then we fight in Washington, right? And so the other side gets defined strictly as enemy rather than as friend with whom I'm in a debate. That happens in a variety of ways because we move away from one another, or because all kinds of things get in the way of us having long glue sessions. And so that makes for less friendship. Here's a study done at Duke University. In 1985, we had 3 close friends per person average. By 2004, it was 2, and more recent studies have it in the 1 to 1.5 range. That we have declined in our besties, right? We don't have as many besties, and the number is going down rapidly. 25% report having no one with whom to share the significant things of life. Do you know that feeling? You've got a great, great thing that's happened, and don't really have somebody to share it with. For some of us, that's a short-term issue where we just got news and nobody's around. But for a lot of Americans, that's a long-term issue. Nobody with whom I can say, oh, you got to hear this news. A quarter of the nation. People who talk only to family members about important matters increased from 57 to 80%. So you know the boomerang kid sort of phenomenon, the movement back toward the ancestral home in a way, right? That has also manifested in people relying on family, which is not a terrible thing, but doing it in a way that decreases the role of friendship in their lives. That's another thing that came up in this Duke study. And finally, the number who depend totally on a spouse rose from 5 to 9%. So you can see, it's not bad to depend on a spouse, and it's not bad to confide in your family, but you can see that they're happening because of an erosion of the other thing, friendship, which is kind of a building block of community and of individual lives. And so this is what Cigna found. 46% of Americans report always feeling lonely. Is that amazing? I'm not going to take a poll in the room. There may be things that mitigate loneliness here. We'll come back to talk about those in a little bit. But that's an alarming number. 27% rarely or never feel that anyone really understands them. 43% feel their relationships are not meaningful. 20% report they rarely or never feel close to other people. You kind of get the picture here, right? I don't need to keep going on this. It's kind of glum picture. So we track how many friends we have, and that's going down, and the result is that we feel differently. We feel more alone in the ways that they're fleshing out in this article. Right? just one that hits very close to this house. During COVID, becoming a minister became exceedingly harder. And by the way, those of you who do attend churches, whether this one or another one, be kind to your pastors. It's the hardest time in my lifetime to lead a church, to lead any group in the United States. I mean, you probably had a debate with somebody in your life about masks or no masks, about vaccines or no vaccines. Imagine having to be the person who has to ultimately make a decision about what the church is going to do, right? And I know that in this church we get good lay help, and when those decisions come, it's not an only one person, but you get the picture. It's a very hard time to be a pastor. Last year, Barna did a survey of pastors and found that 39% of them had seriously considered quitting the ministry during that year. Right? And the reasons they gave were simply the immense stress of the job. That's what I was on a second ago. Look at that second one. I feel lonely and isolated. Pastors. Right? And the third one is the field I plow. Current political division is really hard for pastors to navigate. You got blue here, red here, blue here, red here, and what am I going to preach? How am I going to preach it? How am I going to include people in it? So that's another factor in this. But I did this stat for the loneliness thing. Pastors are lonely for a lot of reasons, but part of that is just the declining value that our culture places on friendship and the way we don't see that as a key central aspiration. So, the latest national poll, and this is to get back to one of the charter reasons for next chapter, and that is to move into the third stage of life or into retirement or into later stages of our daily life. The latest national poll on healthy aging finds that about a third of seniors are lonely. Now, I want you to notice how many people said they were lonely in the Cigna thing? 43%. So seniors are a little ahead. I want you to ask yourself why that is. Right? Same thing as earlier. I can't ask you to shout it out because it won't show up on people watching it later. But think for a second. Why is it that seniors are only a third of seniors are lonely, when 43% of Americans say we're lonely in a relatively constant way? Turns out that Gen Z and Gen Y are the loneliest generations. Isn't that interesting? You wouldn't think that. My boys are heavy into friendships, and friends are a lot more important than their mom and dad, which is something we very much like, right? But those generations are somehow lonelier, and that's a social problem we're going to have to deal with, right? It's not exactly the topic of the night, but it's a social problem we'll have to deal with. Here's something I saw on Twitter a couple years ago. Nobody talks about Jesus' miracle of having 12 close friends in his 30s. Right? It's miraculous. It's funny and it's true. I just gave you the stats, right? It's true. I want you to think for yourself, and I'm not going to have you hold up a number of fingers. But I want you to think for yourself how many best friends you have, the closest friends, BFFs. Right? And think about it for a second, and think about if that number is more or less than it was 10 or 15 years ago for you. Just your own habits. Because we can do stats all day, but we're in a room together, and what matters is what's happening tonight. What matters is what's happening in the lives that are in this room. Think about it for a moment. And now share it with the person next to you. Share with one another. It's not just yes or no. Share with one another whether you've seen yourself follow these stats or not. And I'm not trying to get you to say yes. I don't need you to follow these stats. In fact, we're going to talk about some countervailing forces that are on your side. But for now, just lean to the person next to you and kind of put your heads together about whether you have more friends, less friends, or the same amount than you did 10 or 15 years ago. All right. So let me just get a quick kind of popcorn survey. How many of you told your partner that you have more friends now, more real close friends than you had before? Yeah, that's very fun to look at. How many of you said about the same? And how many of you said, I have fewer than I did 10 or 15 years ago? You know, the three categories are about even in this room. I didn't count, obviously, I'm not that fast. But there is a pretty similar representation for each, which goes against the national averages. And I want to put out there a hypothesis about that comes anecdotally through our experience when we were here for 7 years. So these surveys don't go state to state. The stats on loneliness, the stats on number of friends, the stats on bowling alone don't go state to state. They do national averages, and that's how they present them, and that's how they've set up the research. But my suspicion is that the numbers for loneliness would be lower in Minnesota and in the upper Midwest than in other parts of the country, and the numbers for friendships would be higher. Because Liz and I were here 7 years, and we saw bowling leagues in Minnesota. I'm not kidding. I saw bowling leagues in Minnesota. And you know, you all are into breakfast clubs. Now, it's post pandemic, and you may not have started yours up again, but you couldn't go into Sunsets, which is now Cove, without finding 5 groups around tables talking every morning or every other morning or once a week, right? Minnesota, I think it's the Scandinavian backdrop. I think it's we have to get through winters together, but for whatever reason, this place is more communally connected than any we've ever lived. We lived on both coasts, and we live in Texas now. And none of them do the same level of investment in community. I mean, you have kids sections in your museums, family supportive. There are a lot of things that are set up more healthily for the numbers that we see in Minnesota than I see in other parts of the country. Can't back it with data. It's just impression, but I bet I'm right about that. The second thing that's in your favor is we're standing in a church or sitting in a church. How does that change things? Churches are actually built to be communities, and in the best of worlds, built to be community builders. Right? Churches that overflow from the love they have in their number and the connections they have and the fellowship they have and the closeness they have overflow into a culture around them are churches that are changing the world. Right? You're sitting in one. It doesn't mean you attend one. I don't assume that. I just know that I spend a lot of my time in churches around the nation, and this is a church that supports one another and has a lot of friendships in it. In fact, I remember a time 3 or 4 years into our time here when I realized that all of my friends in Minnesota were members of the church. And I thought I should get around a little bit. So I got a golf group, and it got better. It wasn't a bowling league, but it was a golf group. But you know what I mean. This is a church, and churches, when they're healthy, spark friendship and do things together and have supper in each other's houses and potlucks and all those things, which are cousins of bowling leagues, but they happen consistently as a part of the mandate almost. So you've got 2 things in your favor. 1, you live in Minnesota, and 2, you are standing or sitting in a church and around people who at least value that kind of living. Right? So I've got good news. You kind of defy the odds at some level. But that doesn't mean they don't pertain. Right? That doesn't mean that the delta isn't generally going in the same direction. That we aren't in Minnesota moving to fewer friendships. This sample had about 1/3 of the people who have more friendships. I bet if we cast it wide and did the real research, we'd follow the national average at a lesser pace in Minnesota, because there are so many factors that are atomizing. So if this is true, let's talk about 2 of the works of friendship that I want to just open tonight. There are a bunch of works of friendship. We don't think of friendship as work very often. We think of it as something that we connected with something because we're both stamp collectors, or we both were in the same class in school, or whatever the reason. We got connected to somebody and actually liked one another, we found. And so we started doing stuff and building time together, and lo and behold, a friendship broke out, right? The work of friendship, though, is kind of a necessary consideration given those stats that we've been talking about. It's something that we're leaving and losing we're atrophying our muscles about. We aren't working at it. Now, I lived in the ancient world for quite a while because, not really, I lived studying the ancient world. But I kind of spent a lot of time with ancient people when I was a professor kind of guy. And that was an age when friendship was very obviously something that you worked at and practiced, and it had sort of things that you were trying to achieve together in the way you did friendship. One of them was you want to find a friend who can tell you that you have spinach in your teeth, right? How many of you have a bestie who would say if you had spinach in your teeth, right? How many have a bestie who would say, we saw it earlier, I don't think that's going to be good for you. Remember, we saw on that list of benefits, friends are people who keep us from doing the things that might harm us or that may be bad, kind of anti-health or damaging to us. How many of you have a bestie who would come in that kind of case? We're a little more reluctant, more spinach pointer outers than that, right? Because it's a little closer to the personal, right? In the ancient world, Plutarch, the great sort of first century contemporary of the Apostle Paul, who wrote philosophy and speeches and wrote some biographies of the Caesars, he said, if you can't find a friend who will do that, find yourself a good enemy, right? That's how important he saw having somebody who can tell you when you're kind of going the wrong way, right? And the reason I put that out is every once in a while we're going to flash over to my side of the friendshipy work, and we as a nation are tending to flock with people of our feather. We're tending to flock with people who say exactly what we want to hear. We're watching news we want to hear. We're sitting with friends. Bill Bishop, the Austin American-Statesman reporter, wrote a book called The Big Sort, says we're living in neighborhoods with people who agree with us. We're going to church with people who agree with us. We've got this habit of not checking the friendship box that has somebody in our life who's going to correct us or who's going to at least be there to say, really? Right? We are tending to get lazy at that way of being. As a nation, it's going to get catastrophic if we don't turn it around because Civil War II might be around the corner. But as individuals, we give up something really important if we don't build friendships that are trusting enough and honest enough that we have somebody who can actually say, that's not good for you, who can come in and be a corrective and hope that we'll be a corrective for them. Okay, so that's the inroad that I'm going to take to the work of friendship that is listening. There was a social problem in North Dakota several years ago when Somali and Ghanaian refugees were relocated to cold, white North Dakota. And it caused some social problems. There was fear between the two groups, the sort of white oil workers and farmers who had been there a long time, and the new refugees. There started to be some distrust between them. One of the, I think, 5-generation farmers proposed to the legislator a very draconian immigration policy that wouldn't allow this kind of relocation of refugees. And as the pressure built, the state called in a group called Narrative 4. Narrative 4 is a group that helps people listen to one another long enough to understand each other's stories. And so they called 15 Somali and Ghanaian reps and 15 white oil and farmer people on a Saturday morning, and they had them pair off. So you've got North Dakota white farmer whose family has had the same farm for 5 generations, who's got his farmer hat on. and a very black Ghanaian refugee paired off to tell each other their stories. And listen, they listened for 2 hours straight to one another. So if it's John and Steve, John tells his story to Steve, and Steve can't say anything except to ask clarifying questions for 2 hours. When's the last time you listened to one person for 2 hours? I'm not going to go that long, by the way. And then they took a break for lunch, and then they came back, and the listening went the other way. Now, so far, it sounds like marriage counseling or a lot of things that we've seen, right, that some of us have participated in. The next day, Sunday, they brought everybody back. They got 15 pairings, right? And each group, each pairing, the individual who had heard the other's story had to tell it in the first person. So you've got this white farm hat, 5-generation farmer who's saying, my name is, and says the name of the Ghanaian refugee, and my family was very poor. And then we moved to the city, and my father was able to start a business that was just starting to thrive. And things were looking up for us when all kind of havoc broke out in the country, and we were on the verge of civil war, and we had to get out of there, or we thought we were going to be in danger. And I'm shortening the story by about 1 hour and 57 minutes, right? But you've got this farmer telling the story of a black Ghanaian, and the farmer can't help weeping, and the whole room is reaching for tissues. And then, of course, next, the Somali, or the Ghanaian refugee says, my name is Bob. My family has been on this land for 5 generations, and we are having trouble sharing it. We feel like we like the way things were, and new people came in, and it kind of changed things, and we just want to farm. We just want it, right? And more tears from everybody, because it's in the first person, and they're having to fully understand the other's situation in order to tell the story. I am this person. It changed the social problem just because they listened to one another. And some of them became friends. Isn't that weird? You've got a terrible line between two groups, and a weekend of talking to one another and listening to one another creates not just a release of some pressure and a lowering of social conflict, but even starts to be the seedbed for friendship forming. Just listening. Listening is a skill that we haven't been honing. How many would name it as American virtue? Right? Humility is required for listening. How many of you think humility is an American virtue? Right? Jonathan Sacks called it the orphan virtue of our age, and I think he was right. Because we all know we're right. We all know we're right. When I do this work around the nation, at the end, you say the benediction and the charge and stuff. My charge is usually to these groups I work with, I want you to go, and one time every day for the next 14 days, I want you to look in a mirror and say, I could be wrong. And some of them report back, it was really hard, right? We don't think that the other person is necessarily worth listening to. And so sharpening our listening tools is a friendship act. It's part of the work of friendship. It's part of the work of community. And of course, it's the work of community across difference. And there's a guy at MIT, kind of a rock star leadership guru called Otto Scharmer. And Otto Scharmer has been working with, Jim mentioned that Ann Harbison works with a lot of Fortune 500 companies. He pals in that same kind of neighborhood, and he helps them as leaders. But over the years, he's noticed that the best leaders are the best listeners. And so he's tried to see, how do they listen? What characterizes a good listener, and what makes these people so successful in their job? And he identifies four kinds of listening. The first, above the line, is the kind we most often do. It's called downloading, and we listen for the thing that we agree with or that we want to hear. And we just leave everything else aside. We don't trash it, we just leave it aside. Far Side. There was a Far Side a long time ago. I don't know when it was up, but Far Side comic strip in which the man is talking to his dog, and he's saying, Rex, I need you not to do these 7 things, and I need you not to do this in voluminous. And the dog is hearing blah, 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 Rex, blah, 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 Rex. We're like the dog. We listen for the things that are familiar, that juke with our worldview. And he said, leaders who do that, who listen and say, okay, he agrees with me, so that's a good thing, and don't hear the disagreements and don't count them, are not good leaders, right? So Scharmer says there are 3 better ways to listen. One is listening for new facts. He gives the example of Charles Darwin, who when his Origin of Species came out, when he was doing The Descent of Man, when he was writing his seminal books, he would walk around with a notebook in his vest pocket, and if somebody had something to say that was a compliment and agreed with him, he didn't get the notebook out. But if somebody had a countervailing argument or brought up a point that went against his theory, he got out his notebook and said, say that again. Right? He wanted to know where he could get better, where he could be helped by a dissenting voice or a challenging voice to his facts, right? So the first level is listening with an open mind, the first promising level, listening with open mind for new data or new facts or new positions that you don't know. Right? The second is listening with an open heart, empathic listening. And this one we run into more often in counseling settings, in church groups. Listen so that it's kind of like the narrative 4 thing. Listen so that you can hear what it is to be that person. I'll tell this story here because it happened here. Kate Gayling, who was a high school student here when I was here, and was in the partnership, the debate partnership that was ranked number 1 in the nation among high school debaters. Kate Gayling, member of our youth group. Yeah. And my job when I was here, one of my jobs was when it was Youth Sunday, I met with these scared little speakers who were going to get up and speak at Youth Sunday to tell them, okay, this is how far you get from the microphone, and just kindly help. Kate didn't need that, right? Kate was a nationally ranked debater, and so I said, let's go to coffee, but just so I can hear about debate. And she said, okay, and we went to coffee, and I said, how's it going? What's it like? She said, Alan, I knew that I would love the competition. I'm a really competitive person. I get it from my parents. I get it from their parents, all the way down. I was going to be competitive, and I knew that I would love the research because I'm a sponge for new information, and I love to research the bottom out of things. What I didn't know is that I would become a better person. Because in order to be good at a high level in debate, you don't just have to understand what the other side's plan is. You have to get to the point where you could want their plan. You have to get into their shoes and be able to look at them from the other side. And she got to be a better person in this empathic way, not in a touchy-feely way, but so that she could understand another person's point of view as one that somebody could really have. Right? That's empathic listening extended. Right? The third is the interesting one for me and the kind of work I do, but it also works in leadership, in companies, in families. It works on a lot of levels. It's listening with an open will, or we might say an open spirit. It's listening for the thing that I wouldn't have gotten if we hadn't gotten together. So we're in a conversation, right? We're in a conversation, and John Bastable says something to me, and I say something back, and we're disagreeing, right? But we keep talking, and we realize, you know what? If I put part of what John said and part of what I said together, we'd have something better than we came with. That'd be cool. So you're listening from a future that hasn't yet happened, listening for what could happen because of the relationship. Otto Scharmer said, really good leaders and really good people listen that way, with this curiosity that leads to a different future. Right? So, 3 levels of salutary listening that I think would be worth either jotting down in your memory or jotting down on a piece of paper. Open mind for new facts. If I'm listening to somebody, a friend, somebody who might become a friend, I'm going to listen for what their life is and listen for the real whole thing about it. Listen with an open heart for sort of being empathic as you are with a person, as you listen to them. And the third is listen with an open will or an open spirit, which is I'm open to whatever God wants to do with this conversation. All of those lean us toward the person in humility. It's a huge step. How many of you like to be listened well to? There's another one like, how many of you like friendship, right? Everybody likes to be listened well to, but we don't go as far as to say, well, if I'd like to be, maybe I ought to do that for them, right? So we aren't very good at it. We aren't very good at it. And it takes practice. When I do courageous conversations, I show them this thing, or I talk about listening skills. And then we start to do our conversation about healthcare or euthanasia or climate change or whatever the hot button issue is. 10 minutes in, I'll say, how are you doing on listening? And they all look guiltily at their shoes, right? Because our habits are not we don't override our habits by just learning that these exist. We learn them by practicing, right? And our habits of listening become better, and we tend toward more humility and curiosity if we practice. The second kind of work of friendship is adapting. And this one I want to deal with the possibility that the kinds of glue things that we talked about that are more plentiful in Minnesota, that are more sort of available in this culture for whatever reason, get interrupted because we relocate. Okay? That's one of the transitions that is involved in next chapters. I know a lot of people who retire and go live where their kids live. How many have done that here? How many have moved to your kids? Not as many as I would have expected. My parents did that. They moved to Seattle, Washington to be near my sister and her kids. And they got there and they were near my sister and her kids, but they really missed their social networks they had moved up the coast from Oregon to Washington. And they didn't expect to have as much trouble with that as they did. Adapting, and my parents are maybe the most gregarious people you would ever meet. If they didn't adapt easily to that, then it's hard to adapt to it, right? And so a moving truck comes, you go on your way, you get to the new place, you've chosen, I'm going to be where family is, or I'm going to move to a better weather, or whatever you've chosen as your transition point. Last time, Richard Leider said, in this competition between community and location, if location wins, community becomes hard work. That is, I've always wanted to live in Rio, right? Or I've always wanted to live in Austin, Texas. It's a great town, by the way. The breakfast tacos are good. I've always wanted to live in X place. And so we move there because now we're retired, we can move there. And we get there and we realize we have to start community over again. That's a real interruption. It's a hard thing to do, and it takes work. My parents, the gregarious one, my mom signed on to be the events coordinator for their 55 and older community there. Right? And so they got right in the middle of it, and it took them longer than they thought it would, but they finally made friends because they dove in. How many of you are introverts? Diving? Yeah, raising your hand as an introvert is a strong move. Diving in isn't exactly the native language of an introvert in a new setting. So it's worth asking, how do I construe community versus location, right? As we decide about life, as we decide where we're going to be and what we're going to do, I think Richard Leider was right on the money. He didn't say, always choose community. He just said, count the cost of choosing location. And I think that's worth considering in all transitions. If I'm moving space or I'm moving to even a new neighborhood where I haven't got the same neighbors, what is it going to cost in the way of work for me to build a network that's going to support and I'm going to get all those benefits, and I'm going to be those benefits to somebody else? Right? That's a worthwhile consideration. The other adaptation, of course, is we can talk to people without being with them now. This is a Zoom conference between a grandma and her grandkids. And we did it in spades during COVID. And some of you experienced nearly full communication, and others of you just couldn't get your head around a flat screen representing your family or your friends. We experienced the online connectedness differently. I told you the story of Sam at the beginning, or I indicated the story of Sam. My son Sam was in an online school, and I thought, oh no, he's just going to have this flat experience of just a screen, and he's going to go to classes, he's not going to get to hang out with his students. Well, he was on with them all the time. He was on with his best buddies all the time. So much that his 8th grade year ended, and he had his promotion ceremony in Palo Alto. And so I flew out there with him, and we went to the house of one of his 4 best friends. And you could have heard the shrieks of joy probably over in Berkeley and beyond, right? They were in San Francisco. You could have heard them, I think, states away. They were just completely connected, and they'd never met each other. If we adapt, I mean, it's not like Sam had more skills than we had, Sam and his friends. It's that they accepted this as a possible way forward, and they got good at it. Adapting to different ways of being in community with people is a good way to keep friendships rather than saying, I don't live there anymore. That's an adaptation, and sometimes it's harder work for some than others, but it's another consideration as transitions happen. All right, let's go back to our woman on the train, and then we'll do Q&A. The woman on the train tried to renew a friendship because on that ride, she realized how important it was to her. Right? That's what the tears were about. The woman on the train came to a reckoning that her political position in this case wasn't as important as her friend. And I'm going to close in that realm because I'm going to give you a quick history of Christianity on an important issue. There are 33,000 Christian denominations in the world. 33,000, which means that we disagree, I'm going to go start my own thing. Staying at the table's not that big an option. We aren't going to talk that long. Okay, you think that, I think this, I'm going over here, and I'm going to start my own group. And then we'll start our group, and pretty soon we're going to disagree on something, and it's going to happen again. That's been a tendency of Protestant, notice 33,000 Protestant denominations. It's been a tendency of Protestantism to say, if I don't like what I'm seeing here, I'll go start a new one. There are new Methodist, new Presbyterian, new mainline denominations that have been birthed within the last 8 years. 5, 6 of them in the United States, something like that. When Jesus talked, and this is your homework, when Jesus talked to disciples and others, he talked a little bit about what they had to believe in order to be his people. He talked a lot about how to be community together. Do the math sometime. Read the 4 Gospels and see how many times does Jesus say, if you don't believe this, you're in trouble. And then how many times does Jesus say, here's how you love one another. Here's how you do community together. Here's what you do when somebody sins against you. Here's what, all those things. The bar graph looks like tiny and big. Within 150 years of the church, they had inverted. In 180, Irenaeus of Lyon wrote a book called Against Heresies. And by then, the habit had become, let's find out who's not in. And we'll find out because of what they sign on the dotted line for or not. I'm not saying that beliefs are not important, but in our culture right now, we are really privileging orthodoxy, and it's ending friendships on trains. It's not a bad thing to review Jesus' priority if you're one of those Jesus people. I think he had something to say to people who aren't one of those Jesus people. It's not a bad idea to review his priority set and think about how important community is relative to us being right. That's what I've got. And now it's time for some Q&A exchange, and there's a mic on each side, so if you've got a question, Rick Graff told me, if you've got a question, hold your hand up and somebody will get you the mic. Oh, there are 2 mics here. If you've got a question or a comment, and I only want to hear things I agree with.
Before we jump into that, just a couple other quick things. As we build on our schedule for next year, we will be posting on our website. And if you'd like, you can sign up for updates, emails. You'll have to give us your email address. We promise we won't ping it too often, mainly because we're lazy. But we'll get you updated, and stay tuned for what our schedule is going to be next year, because we're going to keep building it out. So one other quick question. Yeah, it's if you go to WCC and then go to the web page for next chapter, it'll give you all the info you need, and please take that survey. The other thing, we have a few books left from Richard Leiter's presentation, so if you didn't get one and you want one, they're on the table outside, and we had been asking for a donation of $20 for the book, is just what it costs. But otherwise, let's do some Q&A, and then we're off to the after party.
So Q&A on the value of friendship, Q&A on how we listen and adapt, Q&A on all of those things we course through. I ended with one of those, but the whole range. We've got a couple people.
Yeah, I'd like to know your comments on the news media today, good and bad, how it affects us. I know we have been totally submerged with politics, and depends who we're listening to and who do you want to believe.
Yeah. So the study I mentioned that told us that friendship lights up our brain in relatively unique ways. Right? They did a comparison and found that two other things mimic friendship at a lower level. One is opioids, and another is watching the news I like to listen to. Seriously. In a lonely nation, we take recourse to our armchair and Rachel Maddow, or our armchair and Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson. We are finding friends on television because we don't have them on the ground. And that's a function of media. Another bit is, I have a friend here, actually, who in the Twin Cities area, a guy I worked with for a bit, who calls the news angertainment. Right? There was a young woman on Twitter I saw. I have to go on Twitter for my job, and it's a cesspool. But there was this bright spot. Sharon Hottie Miller is a young woman minister in North Carolina, and she wrote one day, I was reading my Bible this morning, and it seems that Jesus got angry a lot less often than I do. Media is contributing, and I don't want to say, some of you are journalists, and that's not I think it's a noble calling, but it's become a business model to make people afraid and angry at one another. And we will click more, we will give more to political campaigns, we invest more in things that make us angry because it produces fear and it produces opposition, and that's going to produce heat. So I'm looking for churches, so it's my challenge to churches often when I go, to say, okay, you're a big enough church, you could start a news service that is actually in the business of reporting the news. If you put your head together with a church that's more conservative than you, if you're liberal or whatever, you could actually take this as vocation. I haven't been taken up on it yet because it would be a very hard job. But somebody ought to do it. Right? Yes, Tom.
Will there be a replay available for tonight's session? I would love to share it with my friends.
Did everybody hear that? Will there be a replay available of tonight's session? And I think Jim said it'll go on by tomorrow, Joel, is that right? Or sometime soon? Yeah, so it'll be up on that page, on the next chapter page. Others? Yes?
Thanks very much for being here, Al.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Do you have any strategies on this? It perhaps used to be that people would have the discussions, get in the fight, and then go to their separate corners. Now perhaps we go to our separate corners before we even start the conversation.
Yeah.
What to do about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So want to hearken back to 2012. 2012 in Minnesota, the marriage amendment was on the ballot. And people wanted to talk about it. But what we saw was exactly the phenomenon you're naming, which is people went to their corner with the other people in their corner and talked about it, but they didn't talk to each other across the ballot, across their beliefs. And so the church, Ann Harbison was a leader in this. Ann and I and John Ross and a couple others tried to put together a courageous conversation in which we said, let's all gather and have a family chat. And 425 people showed up. People are hungry for this, but it's a risky thing to venture individually. You may have a friend with whom you're somewhat estranged or with whom you just don't talk about that stuff. And so you do what, go to your own corner before the fight. It's helpful to have the cover of other people. So doing small group versions of a courageous conversation helps. Another thing that the life swappers that I put up, the narrative 4 thing, it really helps in a church or in a group to pair off and do that kind of listening. Just listen to somebody's life for 10 or 15 minutes and then switch, make it shorter, have a potluck around it. But I find that church to church, this is the most popular thing. You don't get together with somebody necessarily who is directly across from you, but by the time you do this several times, you're going to run into that. And the 2 questions I use are, who are you politically? What do you think politically? And secondly, how do you think you came by those beliefs? So the first one is an ideological question, but the second one is a biographical question. The biographical question becomes the more interesting for people because then they can understand, oh, I see why you believe the way you believe. I don't agree with it, but I see why you believe that. Churches can become places where this kind of conversation becomes normal and is strength in numbers. If you're a bold person who's willing to risk it, find the friend who disagrees with you most and say, let's go get coffee. That would be great, and it's heroic. But there are other ways if you aren't feeling so inclined or aren't feeling capable of crossing at that level of risk or intensity. Does that help? Okay, yes. You, ma'am.
Yes.
Young Ms.
Sir.
Jide. Yeah.
So, Alan, I'm wondering if you've come across any research about intergenerational relationships.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the stat you gave about Gen Z and Gen Y.
Yeah.
I'm a millennial,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So here's an example, Anna. Thank you for the question. I worked with a church in Richmond that happened, by the way, to live on, the Monument Row that's been in the news in Richmond where people were pulling down Robert E. Lee and there was a big fracas about it. This was a church just where Robert E. Lee came down, and so they were trying to do everything they could to help people not kill one another on the spot. And that church had what they thought were red-blue problems. But when they drilled down, after I listened to their first conversation, I realized they're generational issues. Their generations don't talk to one another, so the youngers have come in and want to do church a little differently, and the olders feel like, we've given a lot of our time and money and effort to build this church, and they seem just to flippantly tear down what we did. And the olders are funding the youngers doing this, and there's this sort of, the youngers feel like, man, we're just trapped in the same thing we've been doing for generations. You can see that intergenerational conversation would have been the solution. So that's what we started doing, is we started pairing off in younger, older pairings rather than red-blue pairings. And they started to have these potlucks and listen to one another across generation. And it didn't solve everything, but it moved the needle. And so I told you about my parents who moved into a 55 and older place. Liz and I always thought, okay, that's great. But you love kids, and you love people. So one of the things to think about in transition is, do I want to be isolated from people of other age groups? And if I am moving into an age-isolated place, how am I going to, if I don't want to shut off all the other generations, how am I going to mingle in ways that keep relationships going across generations. So we have 6 generations alive right now. And in the fastest changing technological setting in human history. So you've got microclimates for how we are with one another, how we communicate with one another, and one generation has a hard time understanding another. Wait, TikTok? I was just getting used to Facebook, right? That kind of thing. And by the way, I completely skipped Snapchat. And so how we stay in touch with one another will matter for how we understand one another and how we can build community with one another. Scott.
With the 6 different generations that are alive, early in your presentation you talked about the percent of younger people that feel lonely or don't have friends, and then seniors that had a higher percentage of friends or loneliness. Do the generations carry their percentage to the next generation?
You know,
Do they change depending on the generation?
That's a good question, and I only have anecdotal about it. I don't have stats about it, but and some of the stats aren't available. I don't think it has been customary for the younger generations to be the most lonely or the least friended. I think that's a relatively new happening, and so people are trying to figure it out. I do know, and this is anecdotal, my dad's in the hospital with heart problems 4 years ago, 5 years ago, pre-COVID. And 15 friends come to visit him at the same time, and they all pull up their chairs, and they don't get their phones out. They just talk to one another for 2 hours, just talking. That's interesting. I was, on and on and on, and I'm over checking the football scores on my phone. There is a wisdom to conversational culture that if we do intergenerational things, could be passed on. I remember Anna Jide coming to me and realizing when we had a conversation when she was 7th grader, I think, or 8th grader, she said, I don't want to have my phone when I come to youth group because I have to have it everywhere else. And I think there's headway to be made. And again, I don't want to demonize phones. They can be used to great purposes, but they sometimes divide us, and there's generational availability of wisdom. I think part of why more friends happen in the older generations is a culture of conversation that has continued, that may not be being formed in younger generations quite so soundly.
I just wanted to support something that you were saying about listening. I used to have a communications class at the hospital I worked in, and one of the gentlemen there had been gone for about 3 or 4 months, and he came back after I was telling him about listening and value and all that, and he said, you were absolutely right. He said, I started listening to my clients rather than just telling them what I could do, and he said, I tell you what a difference it made in the sales of it.
Yeah, so she had a communications class in which she was sharing the value of listening in the business world and in other spheres, and one of her students said, I completely get this because I started listening to my clients and it changed everything. Right? Is that close, Nancy? Yeah. Others? Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is around where do you go from, I love everything you have to say about everything that you've said, but where do you go from once you have an understanding of why somebody else feels differently than you do, and you understand each other,
Yep.
and where that decision or
Yep.
idea came from, but where do you go from there? Do you just kind of say, well, okay, we agree to disagree? And
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I have trouble with where do you go from there?
So it would be, did everybody hear the question? It would be a great first move to be able to coexist in space knowing those things. That would be a huge step forward. Tolerance is on the decline, cancel is on the rise, and sort of a culture of contempt. So if we could get over to, I get you, let's agree to disagree, that would be a great step forward. But there's more for us, because the conviction of Paul the Apostle, and apparently Jesus of Nazareth, was that our difference is actually an asset rather than a threat. So Jesus hired as two of his 12 disciples, two guys who were on direct opposite positions on the most controversial question of his age. Namely, how are we going to relate to the Roman Empire? So he hired Matthew the tax collector, who raised revenue for the Roman Empire, and Simon the Zealot, who was a revolutionary who wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire. It would be like hiring Maddow and Carlson for two of his 12 spots. Why do you do that? Well, when he gets to Jerusalem, they ask him, okay, great teacher, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus says something that if you understand it, get back to me. He says, show me a coin. Whose inscription is on it? And they say, Caesar's. And he says, well, then render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. Is he saying pay taxes or not? I don't know. I think Simon and Matthew helped him figure out how to navigate hard situations. In other words, the differences became an asset. So I think I would love to get to a place where we can stay in the room and love one another agapeically, unconditionally, even if we disagree. But I want to take this baby out for a spin. I want to take our differences out for all they're worth. It's kind of like that future, listening from the future that Otto Scharmer has in play. I don't think we've tried enough to get to what are the benefits of having conservative orientation to the world and a more progressive orientation to the world in the same conversation and in the same community. Because sometimes we need one, sometimes we need another. We're kind of either-oring that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
This is just an observation about listening, but I have a former teacher, and we used to talk a lot about communications. And one of the things that I've learned from others, from people I've worked with, is that listening is really powerful. That when you are a good listener, people are attracted to you. And you can get through so many interesting, maybe even difficult conversations with someone who really listens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so listening is the new sexy, right? That's what she's saying. It's attractive. And I don't mean to dismiss, I mean to say that you probably like people to listen to you. We've talked about that. So people who listen to you become more valuable to you. And I've been in boardrooms where the person who listens best ends up with the most power in the room because they've given themselves time to, rather than, oh, but did you think of this or you think of that, they're the last ones to speak. And they hear everyone, and they come up with some kind of a synthesis that nobody else got because they were too busy not listening. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Well, I was going to follow up on that by saying my experience in all my years is that people don't listen. I spend a lot of time listening to people, and Nancy and I were with a group of people for a whole weekend, and we drove away from that, and I knew a lot about those people. They never asked me or listened to me, ever. Yeah. None of them. Yeah. So I think finding good listeners is how the friendship thing. And I don't know how I can't say, would you listen to me?
Steve will listen to you. I know the guy. He's a really good guy.
So as somebody who gets paid to talk, the hardest thing is realizing just shut up.
Yeah.
And I think so many of us are paid to be smart, and we wrap our egos in that.
Yep.
And now that I'm doing more executive coaching, one of the best things someone said is the acronym WAIT. Why am I talking? And if you just wait, all of a sudden shut up and listen, you'll be amazed what happens.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Thanks, Steve. We've got Kristen over here who's got a hand up. And I will say that while that's going over, we need places where we learn how to listen. Because what you're saying is true, and those people don't even realize they don't have the skill. They aren't trying to be oblivious. They just never learned to listen. And part of listening is valuing the person who's talking. And there are a lot of us who can't take ourselves out of the center of the universe long enough to do that. Right? Kristen.
Alan,
Hi, Kristen.
Hi,
It's great
Alan,
to see you.
I love you. Good to see you too. It strikes me as you're talking about listening and all those different layers, how it really is a spiritual practice
Yep.
of listening. And when you got down to the last level of listening, where you get into the curiosity and the leaning into sort of what could be possible,
Yeah.
I think there's something about getting to that place where we put ourselves in a position to be listening to the Spirit. And that kind of goes back to the loneliness. I feel like part of the loneliness is that people don't feel the universe singing to them. They don't have things that they're not controlling and managing and creating and doing themselves. But being in that place, God shows up in these unlikely partnerships and friendships, and where this wholeness comes together in ways we couldn't even imagine. So I don't know, there's something there.
Yeah, that last line is the sort of the money line, I think. If we actually get to the place where we imagine God might show up in this conversation, that's pretty cool. And I've seen amazing things happen when people get humble enough to think, okay, let's just get out of the middle here and see what happens. So thank you, Kristen. Any others? We should probably wrap up in the next 2 or 3 minutes, because some of you have television shows you need to get back for.
All right. Well, thanks.
Yeah, by the way, Thursday night football is not that great this week, so you don't have to worry. It's Panthers and Falcons.
So again, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
It's really great to have you back in the house. And now I know the after party is going to start down at the Muni.
The Muni in about 15 minutes, probably. Yeah.
And we can keep the discussion going, and I've got a number of AV questions for Alan, now that I know that he's an expert, so he can answer those too. So thanks again. Stay tuned for what's coming, and again, appreciate you being here.
Great job, people. Great to be with you.